Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We've got a great group of people and looking forward to an amazing discussion. And please remember, this is always meant to be interactive. So we have the chat room open. So post your questions and we'll get to those following the presentations. But I think everyone knows, but we started this as a two-part series. So back pre-Christmas, we had an anti-racism webinar focused on the Black community. And we wanted to come back with part two in the new year and not put the Black community aside, but also we wanted to recognize that in Milton we have a very large and active Southeast Asian community. So we're very fortunate to have two wonderful panelists with us today. Kevin is a newer chamber member, but I think is known to a lot of people because he's been out to a lot of meetings and this morning joined our HR roundtable as well. But Kevin has a pretty extensive background in the corporate sector and now is consulting and talking to a lot of companies about diversity and inclusion. So I'm not going to get into reading a lot of bios because I want to get right into the discussion and leave lots of time for Q&A. But Kevin certainly has the expertise to help lead our discussion this morning. And I think everyone in Milton has to know Samira as our Ward 4 councillor and probably the ward that is one of the most diverse in Milton. So Samira, wears probably at least two different hats for today's discussion. One is being a member of the Southeast Asian community herself, and has experience, in her lifetime with aspects of diversity, inclusion, and racism. So we want to talk about those. But also because being a ward councillor and having such diversity in her ward, then knows the experience of the people within that area of Milton as well. So I think I'm kicking it over to Kevin to start. So Kevin, over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Scott. Really appreciate that. So to get started today, just a little bit about myself. Spent quite a few years, lots of years. Sorry, I believe the mute button came up, but I'm going to start off again. I'm supposed to kick this off to Samir, but I'll perhaps just start off with some introductions. Spent over 14.5 years, one of the largest corporations here in Canada, to be specific, Air Canada. And my last role there was managing the leadership on the onboarding in terms of make sure that we had a leadership pipeline for the corporation, and my responsibilities were the North American continent, and just making sure that we were reflective of our market was the objective there, and make sure we had met our inclusive strategy. I did start my own consulting firm right after I left Air Canada, and we specialize in equity, diversity, inclusion, and our approach is normally a strategic approach. And to begin today's session, we're going to be focusing on the South Asian community, and I'll pass it over to Samir, who will be kickstarting off our discussions on some of her experiences and some of her lived experiences, which should be able to help us, or rather guide the conversation on this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. Good morning to all of you. I'm happy to see a lot of familiar faces. But I just want to start off by saying that I'm by no means an expert on the issue of racism, diversity, and inclusion. I am a learner like many of you who are here to learn. And so, but I do have a lot of lived experiences and a lot of intersectionalities. And so when Scott reached out to me asking me about if there were any people I knew in the community, local Milton community, who would fit this criteria because they wanted to talk about South Asian community with regards to racism and anti-hate, I proposed that I would be a good fit because as someone who's an elected official, a female politician with the intersectionality of being a woman of color and a Muslim woman as well, I I felt that I would fit the bill and would be able to do justice to this. So that's why I'm here. And I wanted to thank Scott and Alyssa and Sam for all the hard work they do and for giving me the opportunity, and many of people like me, myself, the opportunity to express ourselves and to share ideas and thoughts with the general community and with the chamber members. So thank you, Scott. And so one of the first things I want to start by saying is the why. Why are we here today? Because recently, what I've been hearing, and this is a perspective from someone of color, is that, we have the Black History Month, and we recently designated January 29th as the Day of Remembrance for the Quebec mosque victims. And the federal government has also declared banned for white supremacist groups. So there's this kind of talk that I've been hearing, not directly, but indirectly, that, what more do we need to do to make these people happy? And so I just wanted to address the fact that, yes, all of these steps that have been taken by the government are great and are the steps in right direction, but that doesn't mean these are solutions, because racism has been going on for hundreds of years. And so it's a journey that we have to take to try to eradicate it. It's not going to end by taking one or two measures. It's going to end by taking steps, continuous persistent steps, small steps, big steps that will take us to the end of our journey, which is the goal to eradicate racism from the society. And I understand that it's hard to talk about racism because, sometimes people who are overtly, covertly, indirectly exhibiting racist behavior are sometimes our good friends, are sometimes our neighbors, or sometimes are even own family members. So it's hard to talk about this. For someone of color, it's hard for me to talk about it, and many other people, when we sit down and talk to each other, it's hard because we're always afraid of coming off as, preachy or divisive and trying to, divide the community about talking these things. But it's important because we're not trying to divide the community. We're trying to actually highlight the division that actually already exists. So that is the difference. And that is why I feel that I needed to go on this little tangent to explain why we are doing this and why I wanted to talk about it. Because when we talk about racism, it helps us understand people better. It helps us understand our neighbors, our friends, our community better. It also helps us to understand and identify our own internal fears. Sometimes we have prejudices and preconceived notions and just irrational fears about, people who are different from us. So when we start this conversation and we talk about it, it helps alleviate these things. And we are successful in finding commonalities. Hey, we love the same food, we love the same music. So we try to find those matching traits, and that kind of builds a strong community. And Scott mentioned that I'm a local counselor as well. So I feel like when I talk about this, when all of us talk about it, we're actually building a small uh, interwoven community because we're understanding each other better. And in the end, the last point I want to say is why we want to talk about is because for our youth, we say a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. Those are great words, but we want to put that into practice and action. And the way we do it is when we start talking about it, because we wouldn't have to designate January 29th as the day to commemorate the Quebec victims if all of these conversations were a regular part of our society. So that is the goal here, to keep talking about this, to make sure we don't have any such incidents in the past. We only have to look a little south of the border to see what happens if you ignore these important topics. So having said that, I just want to move quickly to the regular microaggressions. I'm going to call it microaggressions and not open racism, because we're polite in Canada and racism does exist. And Kevin will talk more about it. He has an excellent slide deck prepared for all of you on how to deal with that. But as someone who's experienced it, I can tell you that these are the following microaggressions brown people, South Asians regularly face in Canada. And top of the list is the fresh off the boat syndrome, which basically, in easier or simpler words, is that, the perception that, people from this region are not very well educated, they lack in their proficiency in English. So when I was new to Canada, a lot of times I was told, oh my God, I can't believe that you can speak good English. So I heard that a lot as a new immigrant. That was years ago, 17 years ago, but I did hear it. And so that is one of the things that a lot of brown people face. And then there's also the assumption that, mostly all South Asians are too cultural and too rigid and very reluctant to assimilate. Nothing could be further than truth from that. I feel it depends on personality. It's the same for every community. There are people who are more social and there are people who are not so much social. So it's all about that. But these are the preconceived notions a lot of the brown folks feel. And um, the notion that being brown is a liability. So, for example, you apply for a job and you don't get it, and you're sharing it with a friend. There's many instances when people will hear something like, "Oh, you have so many layers to think about," and we all know what that means, right? So. It's this constant dealing of the fact that I am a person of color, and you always have to keep that in your mind, and that is a burden. And it shouldn't be. Nobody should have to be forced to think about always that what their skin color is or what their name sounds like, which is why they're not being able to go where they're going. And a lot of this also comes from the assumption that you always have to keep defending your successes. So a lot of the talk I hear from many immigrants who come from South Asia is that, we always have to defend our qualifications. We always have to prove that, yes, we have a 20-year experience doing this, but, we are here in Canada, so we have to start everything from fresh again, start from scratch again. And even when we put in the best efforts, we feel like we're constantly having to prove that, we are just as good as anybody else, just as qualified. So I've heard a lot of this as well. And I personally have not felt that because I've always in my professional career worked from home, but my husband has, and I've seen it very closely in that sense as well. And of course, I'm Muslim and my husband is too, and we're a Muslim family. And so the biggest assumption we face is that, there's preconceived notions of ties to terrorism. And so it has gotten better over the time. And that is because of a lot of, public effort and a lot of education efforts that have been taken by the government, but it still does exist. You just have to kind of be in a place where it is prevalent to kind of feel it. For example, if you go to some other areas of Ontario and you enter a restaurant, every head will turn and look at you. So, so that is something that I also face. I faced it last year. So it does exist. So these are the common things. And one more thing is that, the bunching of all the brown people in one, this even just talking about the region of South Asia, there's Indians, Pakistanis, there's Bangladeshis, there's Sri Lankans, there's Nepalis. There are so many nationalities that belong to South Asia. So when you say South Asian, it actually is a very good melting pot of many, many cultures, nations. And so constantly having to tell people, where I'm really from. So where are you from? No, where are you from back home? Where are you originally from? So these are the questions we continually face. And one of the things that I've been reaching out to a lot of women's group of color and stuff. And one of the common theme is that especially the women, they feel that they're invisible. So an example I can share is that a lady shared with me that at her workplace, whenever there are opportunities in a group setting, where, you know, you have to speak up or share your thoughts. She feels like she is invisible and not around. And so she always has to constantly do things to make sure that she is acknowledged, that she does exist and she's part of the group. So these are the few things that I wanted to talk about. But going back to the topic of, the preconceived notion of ties to terrorism, brings me to the topic of Islamophobia. And I want to say that Islamophobia does exist in Canada, and and it exists today, and it existed years ago. And so one resource I can share with you all is the National Council for Canadian Muslims, NCCM website. And if I am given the opportunity to share my screen, I would like to share their page where where they have no, let me just check where it is. Nope. Okay, I can't share it, but I can just read it out to you all. So on their page, they have the incidents of
Samira, you're cutting out. Are you there?
I think we lost her.
I think we lost her based on the.
Kevin, I don't know if you want to pick it up, and then when Samira comes back, we can come back to Samira.
Absolutely. So Samir is sharing some great insights onto her lived experience, and we're hoping that we can make this a very live interactive session where we can perhaps be able to take some questions from some of the people in the audience. But at this point in time, I think maybe I'll jump into my presentation, and I'm going to be using some of her examples, and I took some time to jot down some of her experiences. And I'm going to relate this to the presentation that I prepared today for the chamber. And when we do get Samir back online, I'll pause for a second and allow her to complete the presentation, if that's okay with everyone. Okay, so I'll share my screen. Give me a second, please. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Very good, thank you. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about some of the items that, some of the issues that Samir mentioned in her presentation there, and I think she's back, so I think we'll let her complete the conversation. Give me a second. Samir, feel free to jump in and
Sorry, guys. So what happened was that my internet just got cut off from my laptop, so I am now using my LTE. So sorry about that. And I was in the middle of talking about Islamophobia. So I'm really sorry about that to all the people who are watching. But let me just continue from there. And so I was just sharing incidents of Islamophobia even as early as 2019. There's not been much recorded for the year 2020, of course, because of the pandemic, but it is a real threat. And things like the Quebec Bill 21 don't help either, because this bill, and I'm going to read verbatim because I don't want to say anything wrong. The Bill 21 was signed into law on June 16th, 2019, so just 2 years ago, almost. The law prohibits a person who exhibits religious symbols such as the hijab, turban, or kippah from holding several public positions of power.
public servants such as police officers, lawyers, and even teachers cannot identify themselves as member of a faith group while carrying out their duties. So this is what the Bill 21 is. And in my opinion, it is a law that intends to enforce second-class citizenship based on an individual's identity or religion. And so a subset of Islamophobia is hijabophobia. And I constantly speak to South Asian females who wear the hijab, Muslim women, and they say that they are subjected to so much hate and racism, and it's open. It's not even a microaggression. It's about going to grocery stores. They face it going to a restaurant. Like I said, you enter and everybody looks at you. So these are the things that are prevalent and faced by the South Asian Muslim women, so to speak. And so, I mean, I've now identified all the microaggressions faced by the South Asian community: Islamophobia, hijabophobia, etc. There are men in turban who face it too, and the Sikh community, you will see, has spoken up openly about it. And having leaders like Jagmeet Singh, the NDP party leader, helps, because when you see someone at that position who is wearing a visible symbol of his religion, it helps normalize the fact that it is, okay, and you are as Canadian as anybody else, even with the head covering that you have. It doesn't differentiate you as a Canadian. And so that does help, but it doesn't mean that we can stop talking about it, and we must keep talking about it. But in the end, I wanted to keep this just till 10 to 15 minutes. And I know that I've gone over that for sure. But I just wanted to say that, all the people who are attending today, it is so important for all of this activism and advocacy to move forward, and it cannot without the help of allies. And so I want to thank everybody who joined today, because you are exemplifying what it takes to be a strong ally, and that is to listen and to learn and to basically try to find your own internal bias. And Kevin will talk more about it, but we all have our own internal biases. I have my own internal biases. So I'm happy to see the attendance today, and I hope that my little bit of a talk helps people identify, yes, so that is the website, identify the common microaggressions faced by the South Asian community. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you for listening to me.
Thanks, Amir. I'll take it over from here, and I really appreciate the conversation and sharing some of your experiences. That was great. I just want to make sure that we can have at least an interactive session. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the slides that I had prepared for the chamber today, and so at least we can have room for at least an interactive session where people can field their questions. And I just want to make sure that we can. I just want to make sure that we can focus on that concept of conversation. And if we're going to be normalizing this conversation, or we're going to be normalizing these environments, then we need to recognize the power of conversation. And my intention today is that I'm going to meet you where you are. And we may not necessarily agree on some of the views that we express in terms of the differences that are right across, the Canadian landscape. But then again, it is my intention that we are driven to a point of curiosity, to question some of those things that we've experienced, or even to question our surroundings, to question our environments. And that's the intention, is that I will always meet you where you are. You may not necessarily agree with what Samir or myself may say at this point in time, but at some point, I'm hoping it's going to drive you to a point of curiosity large enough to move you to action. And so without further ado, let me just jump into the presentation. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to be talking and focusing on some of the microaggressions, which are simply what we largely experience within the Canadian sector. So I'm going to jump into microaggressions. I'm not really going to go into my biography here because we've already spoken about my background and how I got myself into this line of work. And so we'll jump in right into microaggressions. So what are microaggressions? Microaggressions are, as termed by Kevin Nadal, who's a psychology professor, said that they're simply the everyday, subtle, intentional, and oftentimes unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias towards historically marginalized groups. And in this context, we're going to focus on the South Asian community, but it can apply to all other differences that we have right across the sector. The term was actually first coined by Dr. Chester Pierce. It was a Harvard University psychiatrist after he regularly witnessed insults and dismissals inflicted towards African Americans from non-Black Americans. Another psychologist, Dr. Daryl Sue, went further to refine the term microaggressions. And he refined the concept of microaggressions in his 2007 published article, Racial Microaggressions and Everyday Life. Really good read. I encourage everyone to go through this, where he classified 3 racial transgressions, which I have summarized below. So we have microassaults, which are conscious, explicit, intentional actions, such as displaying a noose or even a swastika. Microinsults, verbal or nonverbal communications that convey or demean someone based on heritage, like asking a Black person how they got their job or got into a school, or even asking a Muslim Canadian to go back to wherever they came from. Microinvalidations, communications that dismiss someone's lived reality, such as questioning a woman's report on unwelcome lewd behavior by a male colleague, or questioning a Muslim's actual hate experience. Some people do question these experiences, and that should not be tolerated. If anything, it should drive someone to curiosity to find out, why is it that I feel the way I do? So why do they exist? Microaggressions are rooted in biases, which largely form stereotypes. We all have biases. I have biases, you have a bias, and it is actually an inevitable part of human brain functioning. And the intention here is to make sure that we can recognize some of those biases, which are largely informed by our environments and how we're brought up and who we associate with, what we associate with. A gap in even historical context sometimes can form these biases. So the mind works incredibly by categorizing things together and making connections to make it easier for us to choose between different options and takes shortcuts in order for us to make quick decisions. When faced with unfamiliar settings, the human mind will use these shortcuts from widely applicable and sometimes misinformed associations, such as stereotypes, to inform decisions. Now, Dr. Lieberman at the Neurodiversity Institute actually came up with a very good model and summarized 150 plus biases that exist in the human brain to about maybe 5. And I encourage everyone to take a look at the SEEDS model, which really explains why I would rather choose someone that has my experience or or agrees with me, as opposed to someone that may sometimes disagree with myself. So we tend to choose people that look and think like us, which is a common functioning, or rather it's a normal function of the human brain. So what are some of the impacts that we see out of microaggressions? Exclusion. If an environment does not have some type of representation where I feel like I'm psychologically safe, then there's going to be feelings of exclusion. Everyone wants to be part of a team. And if I'm not able to feel like I'm part of the team, then I'm obviously going to feel some type of exclusion out of the entire team. And it can also be mentally and psychologically draining for the victim in this case. Some things that may be taken as a lighthearted joke, like, I do remember a good friend of mine, we were traveling and we were somewhere down in the States, to be exact, this is North Carolina. The gentleman wears a turban, and I do remember someone asking the gentleman why he was wearing a sheet on his head. It's not okay to say that, and as much as someone may think it's funny, in whatever context, I'm not sure why anyone would think it's funny. It simply creates an othering of another culture that one may not necessarily clearly understand. Invalidation. People will invalidate your experiences on an ongoing basis. And I think I can perhaps use some of Samir's examples where, she felt like people invalidated her experience, which does not necessarily help the cause in this case. The other one will be internalization. Sometimes people will, the victims will internalize a message where someone may assume it's a lighthearted joke and can go to a point where someone goes as far as even changing their name because they want to assimilate and want to be part of that environment. I know so many people that I went to school with. One good example is a gentleman that I went to school with that faced discrimination just based on his name, and was not able to get a security pass for many years. And we had started the job together. And having gone through a restricted transportation security clearance, where I got the clearance in about 2 weeks, this gentleman spent a good 5 years trying to get security clearance. And as soon as he changed his name, all of a sudden he got it. He got his clearance. What this does is simply alienates the person from who they really are. So you're no longer really the person you want to be. You cannot be as authentic if you go to a point where you actually try to assimilate by actually changing your name. A lost sense of belonging. It can be very confusing for the victims when they do face microaggressions. And a great example would be sometimes you can find yourself laughing with the aggressors in this case. Someone may be passing on a joke, and to be part of the team, you'll find yourself confused and even start laughing at the joke just to fit in and to avoid being excluded, because everyone wants to be part of the team. And sometimes can come across as, okay, well, line up, or it's just a joke. But really, it's not really a joke. Someone is actually othering you, and you're no longer part of that team. And as much as people will buy into that, you can only imagine what that does in terms of that person. And you're left with someone that's fractured and that cannot necessarily be as productive within their environment. What are the impacts on the organization? I cannot be as productive in a place where I don't feel psychologically safe, and that affects the bottom line. I'm only at my best when I'm allowed to be my authentic self, and that applies in every other setting. So in terms of our topic today, if we were to exclude our South Asian community in this case, or rather our Muslim Canadians, in such a way that we other what they affiliate with, in this case religion, then they cannot be as productive, because they do feel like we cannot separate the individual from what they affiliate with. And so you have a loss of productivity at your workplace. This also ends up in a toxic workplace, where people will, if people cannot get along, or rather there's distrust amongst team members or how other people view you, then you're going to end up in a situation where people do not necessarily think it's a healthy workplace. And a lot of distrust means just a lack of collaboration for most people within your team. Unfortunately, what this does is it recluses the victims to the background, where they're not fully able to participate within their environment, and where you can have a lot of talent, and a lot of organizations are sitting on a lot of talent. What happens is that people are not being able to participate because they face distrust from some of the aggressions, microaggressions they face on a constant basis. And this could be verbal, nonverbal gestures. It could be even just by your inactions. Inactions are simply microaggressions as well. If an organization does not show me that they're willing to move the needle on equity, diversity, and inclusion, you can only imagine how that would be perceived by the receiver. And sometimes what that leads to is attrition. People sometimes will just exit, and people want to be part of a winning team. No one wants to be part of a losing team. So what happens to the victims in this case, sometimes they'll just decide to exit. So here are some of the things that you shouldn't do. And I'm going to try and be as detailed as I can with this. And I know we're running out of time, so I'll try and pick up my pace on this. Some of the things that we should not do is pivot the topic. There's always a constant urge for people to respond, which is a natural, simply a natural remedy for what the brain is trying to do. It's trying to protect yourself from harm. And we're almost on a constant basis forced to respond in order to defend ourselves. If someone is telling you that there's a problem somewhere, it is important that we're driven to curiosity to understand exactly why they're saying what they're saying, why they're saying what they're saying. And so I'll give you an example. When someone says Black Lives Matter, the response should never be all lives matter. Of course, all lives matter, but that's pivoting the topic. That's not what the discussion is about. It should be, okay, let's find out why someone is actually screaming out Black Lives Matter. If someone is talking to you about Islamophobia, we should not be pivoting this to another topic. And I want to make sure we can focus on this in this context, or rather in this topic. And so if Samir is telling you about an issue where there's persistent and pervasive Islamophobia right across the organizations, then we should not be bringing other conversation to that topic. We should be able to address that fully, embrace it, and understand exactly what it is she's trying to convey to everyone that's on that platform. Let's never use this sidestep of difference. As soon as someone brings up a situation where we have Islamophobia here, there's always a quick sidestep where someone will say, "Oh, well, there are many other differences," and I think Samir went within the lines of saying that what else can we offer this groups? It should never be that we're trying to sidestep what the issue is. If anything, we should use the power of conversation to really unpack and understand what it is that someone is actually trying to convey to us. We should never use tokenism, or rather use a PR moment through tokenism. And I'm just going to quickly maybe touch on what tokenism is. Tokenism is the act of, or the practice of hiring people based on differences, devoid of the consideration that there's intention to actually make a difference, and is perhaps something that's not carefully thought out, where we go out there and seek people that look different from our teams in order to convey a message that says, okay, we have diversity within a team. We all have to remember that if we're to really have a thriving environment, then for the people that we onboard, then we got to make sure we have a thriving environment. And I'm going to use the analogy that a good friend of mine used one time, is that if you're trying to grow mangoes, you should not be planting apple seeds. You should make sure that you have a thriving environment to ensure those mangoes can grow to begin with. Next point will be deny systemic racism exists. We should never sit back and deny that Islamophobia does not exist. Of course it does. The very fact that I'm someone that was born and raised Christian, I can tell you that for sure, that even within that upbringing, we had situations that in effect perpetuated Islamophobia. And so to me, the moment was when I recognized and realized it, and it did something about it to stop that. We should never make excuses why things haven't changed. That doesn't really help the cause. It should, again, we should be driven by curiosity to really drive the conversation. Don't try and count the number of racist incidents to determine if there's actually a problem within your organization. It doesn't help. I would say perceived notions will always be different. Even when I mention equity, diversity, inclusion, those things mean very different things depending on who's asked the question or who's actually on the receiving end. So I don't think we should ever sit back and try and count the number of incidents or incident reports to determine whether there's actually a problem. I think we should be driven by trying to make sure we can facilitate those conversations and have an open dialogue to meet people where they are and make sure that we can convey these messages that are effective and meaningful and respectful. Don't stay silent. The moment we decide to stay silent is when the damage starts occurring. Staying silent is being complicit, and you're more or less, in effect, perpetuating some of these barriers that we've seen that create hate and exacerbate that hate experience. So I encourage everyone to be an ally and support, what organizations are doing or people that are speaking up. In this case, such as Samir, in terms of recognizing some of those things that could be very harmful for our communities. So how do we confront microaggressions? I'm just going to give you a few simple tips. Call them out when you experience them. Let's unpack why someone thinks what they think. And this should allow the person, in this case, the aggressor, a point of reflection, a point to understand why it is what they're saying is actually offensive and where it's coming from and what's creating that type of bias. What's creating that type of stereotype for them to think that you should think the way you should think of me, the way you do right now in 2021? We should always seek to understand and not to respond. I do believe in the power of listening as opposed to the power of just responding. And we should hesitate we should avoid the urge of responding to a situation and actually seek to understand as opposed to just responding. We'll have biases. I have a bias. I'm constantly navigating my biases. And I do encourage everyone to recognize and realize that we all have biases that we can confront on an ongoing basis. Don't allow yourself to be cluttered by those thoughts of things that you don't understand. And I would encourage everyone to replace that with a dedication to understand anything that you're unfamiliar with. Consider the lived experience of someone else. If someone is screaming, there's a problem. If someone is saying something about a situation, there's certainly a problem. So let's recognize that moment and seize that moment. Be an ally, be an active participant. Don't just be a bystander in this case. I would encourage everyone to make sure that they can support anyone that's speaking out in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion, to allow these conversations and to normalize this conversation. And as soon as we normalize the conversations, it gets a lot easier. Confronting biases. I'm just going to summarize what Price Waterhouse did in terms of confronting biases, which is fairly, I think this was very neat in terms of trying to make sure we can counter some of these biases that we experience. Trying to broaden perspectives. Homogeneity kills diversity of thought and cultivates bias. If you're surrounding yourself with people that look like you or people that have the same experiences, I can almost guarantee you're harboring some biases and they're just going to be perpetuating the same thing. I encourage everyone to seek people and other environments that are different from them in order for you to actually realize some of those biases that exist within yourself. Be objective. Subjectivity limits your scope and harbors blind spots. I can't go further than explain that. I think it explains itself. Overcome your stereotypes. Stereotypes influence objective thought, in effect perpetuating bias. So I do encourage everyone to ensure that you can try and avoid those stereotypes. But again, a dedication of trying to make sure you can focus on understanding those things that you may be unfamiliar with. And then challenge your assumptions. Assumptions limit our critical thinking ability, which should be something that we should all strive to do. So some of the things that organizations can do, depending on how big, how small you are, I think everyone has an option to do this, is consider an equity, diversity, and inclusion workplace assessment. I can guarantee you that most organizations will find themselves in a situation where they do have some of these problems. And I have not been to an organization that does not have this as a challenge. So consider an equity, diversity, and inclusion workplace assessment. Just look around you. You gotta remember, the way we act as individuals is largely influenced by the way the society we live in looks at us or views us. So it is important to understand that that diversity of thought is largely influenced by how I deal or navigate through my environment. Consider the representation in your teams and what that does to create some of the biases that we've talked about. Consider your intended outcomes. Consider your goals. Consider exactly where it is that you want to move. Consider where you're at right now and where you want to go. Come up with a plan. This is beyond the conversation. Develop a plan with the help of an expert. Consider a strategic plan that will address the ongoing needs of your organization. And this can go as far as your learning environment, your communication strategy, you name it, in such a way that all your goals are aligned to your business goals as well, or your clients' needs. And most importantly, obviously, make sure you have and establish accountability measures. Now, I'm just gonna open the floor for any questions, remarks, or if anyone wants to share any thoughts on our presentation. And I really thank the Chamber for the opportunity to be able to speak to the entire team. And in our comment box here, in the chat box, I'm going to be putting an article that I think will be beneficial for many people on this platform that have joined us today in terms of recognizing and confronting microaggressions. Thanks again.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. Before we get into the Q&A, we have our MP Adam Van Koeverden who has joined us. So the federal government is doing a lot in terms of diversity and inclusion. So I just wanted to give Adam the opportunity to jump in for a second.
Well, thanks so much, Scott. That's a surprise, but it's nice. I just hopped on towards the end of the presentation. I was in a caucus meeting until just recently, but nice to see so many friends on the call, so many people that unfortunately this pandemic has allowed us to become so distant from. Kevin and I had an awesome meeting just recently. Thank you so much, Kevin, for your time about a week back, maybe 10 days. I'm losing track of my Zoom schedule now, but you relayed to me, so many important issues that our government needs to focus on. I agree that we've done some good work, but more is always necessary, and it's important to highlight not just during Black History Month, but also throughout the entire year. I met recently with the Foundation for Black Communities as well, and they are doing some really, really important anti-Black racism work in ensuring that Black communities across the country have access to the same philanthropic aid that other communities have always had. Just this morning, I addressed a group of 7,000 students across Halton and Greater Halton area, so included some of Hamilton and stuff, but with Ijeoma Oluo, who is an author with Milton Public Library, bringing her in, New York Times bestselling author on a book that she wrote called So You Want to Talk About Race. And it highlights the need to develop a more empathetic society, one that's more conscious of anti-racism efforts and more conscious of our own biases and where we are in the conversation. So I'm so grateful for leaders like Kevin, and thankful that we have such a great Chamber of Commerce that keeps making sure that issues like this are confronted. I'm the Parliamentary Secretary for Diversity and Inclusion in Youth, so it's a long title, but one of the things that I am tasked with working on is implementation of our anti-Black racism program across the country. So that involves investments in anti-Black racism efforts and education from coast to coast to coast, not just here in Halton and the GTA in Ontario, but we work with organizations from Victoria to Halifax, St. John's, all the way up to Iqaluit. And the work is ongoing. It's long. It's hard for the organizations. I recognize fully that the burden and the obligation of that work often falls directly on the overburdened shoulders of diverse communities and Black communities specifically, if we're talking about anti-Black racism. I know that today's focus was more on anti-racism in the Asian and South Asian communities, and that's a priority for me here in Milton in supporting a constituency that has so many diverse people from South Asian communities. And Islamophobia is a problem that our government is facing head on, working with community, working with NCCM and many other great advocacy organizations in identifying the root causes, providing educational opportunities, funding organizations that are doing that work, because ultimately, again, the burden falls on community. But we do have a government that's focused on this, that recognizes systemic racism, that calls out systemic racism, that isn't afraid to say that we all have a implicit bias that is a prejudice that we all need to identify and we need to focus on, we need to work beyond. I'm a proud member of Parliamentarians Black Caucus, led by MP Greg Fergus, who's amazing. And we set forth last summer, following a time of hardship for the Black community in North America, following the shooting of far too many Black men and Black people in the United States, but then ultimately in the death of George Floyd. And the 5 big items that we put forth last summer in our so-called manifesto for Parliamentarian Black Caucus, which is available on my website if you'd like to see it, are all being put into action by this government. So I'm really heartened to see quick action from our ministers of business and finance, our ministers of procurement, our ministers of justice and public safety, our ministers of basically looking at who the public service is in Canada and how they're functioning for Canadians. So we're getting down to the root causes of much of the prejudice. Our recently announced Black Entrepreneurship Program is another good start. We just announced some capacity funding for organizations across the country. So I'm proud of the work that we're doing, but more is always necessary. And tomorrow I'll be standing up in the House of Commons virtually at this very late stage in Black History Month to acknowledge and celebrate Black History Month, and also talk about some of the outreach that I've been doing over the course of this month. And it will not stop in March or April. It will keep going because Black history is Canadian history, but more importantly, the future of Canada needs to be one that's more resilient, more compassionate, more understanding, fairer, and more just for all members of society so that everybody can participate in every level of society and the economy. So thank you, Kevin. You're an expert on this. Your work is incredible. Thank you to Scott for making this happen. And thank you to everybody who's joined. Thank you for recording this. I think it's great. We can share this with people if they weren't able to join over lunch. My office is a resource to you all. Please reach out anytime if I can help, if my office can help. I also have incredible staff on this call. Hafsa Asadullah happens to be an expert. She has a degree in diaspora studies and works. She's on a couple of boards, and I don't have to pump her tires. Her tires are fully inflated, but she happens to know quite a lot about anti-South Asian racism, and our office is very well equipped to guide you in the right direction if you're interested in finding more resources. Thank you very much. Sorry for the long intervention.
No, that's great. Thanks, Adam. We appreciate your taking the time to join us. You're a great champion for Milton and for diversity and inclusion, so we appreciate that. Samira, I want to talk to you for a second because we talk about the Milton community, and I think everyone assumes that that racism is elsewhere, that it's it's other parts of Canada, it's in the States, but I'm sure it's alive in Milton. What are your experiences in Milton versus other communities?
Thank you so much, Scott. That is a very tough to answer question, but I'm going to try to do justice to it. And I think it is very much alive in Milton and especially Halton all over. I am also part of the anti-hate, Halton anti-hate network. And so in our meetings, we continuously get to hear about what it is to be living in Halton and Milton specifically and being a person of color. And I can tell you for a fact that, there's this idea of two worlds that are divided. And so, there's one world that is true and true when we're talking specifically about Milton. There's this world that's true and true Miltonian, born and raised here, very proud of the heritage, which everybody should be, because if you don't, hold on to your roots, you don't know where you're gonna go next. And so that is admirable. But then there's also this new section of Milton that has, moved to Milton the past 7-8 years, which is the south of Derry area, one of the areas I represent as a local councillor. And I feel like, I, as a councillor, as a person elected in politics, have the privilege, and I accept this privilege that, I get to spend time with both sections, I feel, and I have great friends in both sections, and take great pride in being a Miltonian myself, a local parent. Everything said and done, I feel like there is a great cultural divide. And I think I know both sections, the old Milton and the new Milton, so to speak. Everybody is a great person in both sections, but I feel this is this culture, and I always talk about it, and it resonates with so many people. So I'm feeling confident to share it here that when I speak to people for part of the old Milton, I hear the concept or the feeling that the new people should reach out to us and try harder to be part of local Milton stuff. And when I talk to the new Miltonians, I hear that, hey, we're never invited to any of the local Milton stuff that goes on. So I feel like this is not, I wouldn't even classify it as the othering. I would classify it as just cultural differences, because most of the new Miltonians are immigrants like myself. And in our culture, we would like to be invited to something. And in the other cultures, North American cultures, you want people to come and participate, and you just put out an invite and you expect people to come in. And I feel like that is just where the problem lies. And if we can just try to find a way to bridge these two cultural differences, is what I'm going to call it, I think we'll have better results, and we'll have better, intermingling and melting pot of Milton's two, new and old. And at the end of the day, I know one thing is that Miltonians are really proud to be Miltonians, are happy to call this town our home, happy to raise kids here, which is why a lot of the Miltonians are young families with lots of kids, because we love the schools here, we love the parks here. And even at council, and my colleague, my is here, he will attest to the fact that, we are always trying our best to provide the best service locally, when it comes to infrastructure like parks and stuff, so that, our families can walk to these parks and walk to their schools and make sure that, things are done to cater to their needs. So yes, there is racism, uh, more covert than overt in Halton and Milton, but I feel like it's not an impossible situation. I feel like once we get to the root of it, we can work together to alleviate it. Great question, Scott.
Thank you, Kevin. The seed model that you were talking about, as I read about that, it talks about the fact that if you have a brain, you have a bias. So there are some biases that are in our brains in terms of, if you're taking a road to the grocery store, you have a certain bias about which route you take.
Yeah.
So obviously some of those biases will stay with us and maybe positive or negative, but obviously there are the biases that are very negative and we can't have in our brain. So can you talk a little bit about that, the duality?
Sure, that's a great question. Thanks, Scott. We all have a bias. I have a bias, you have a bias, and they're just normal functioning of the human brain. And I think the key here is making sure that we can understand how those biases play out in our minds, or rather that move us to action. If I'm looking at a situation where, let's say for example, in Samir's case, where I'm looking at maybe a religious symbol, what makes me assume certain stereotypes about someone who decides, or rather someone that wears a turban, or someone that affiliates within the Islamic religion, or someone that affiliates with Judaism, or someone that affiliates with Christianity, whatever the case is, we should start paying attention to how we associate some of those actions we're going to take after we've tried to consciously think about what it is that's going across our minds. And there's nothing wrong with these biases. It's just a matter of making sure that we can perhaps move ourselves into a rational thought as opposed to the subconscious thoughts that go through our minds. And the dedication should be making sure we can fill those gaps or those associations that we don't necessarily understand with a dedication to understand them. So in this case, I would be filling my mind, or rather my dedication, with making sure I can understand the Islamic faith. Not necessarily that because you want to join the faith, but understand exactly what the traditions are, why they do them, how they do them. And they can, this can honestly be simply having a conversation with Samir and exploring and humbling yourself in such a way that you want to learn, as opposed to, or rather how this is a way of confronting some of those biases across our minds. And I think it's a great tool to understanding how we function as human beings and why we are where we are. And so I think the SEEDS model does provide a great guidance to that.
Perfect. Thank you, Kevin. I'm aware of the time and we're coming to a close, but Samira and Kevin, before we do close, I want to offer sort of parting comments. If there's one thing you want to leave the audience with, what would that one thing be? Samira, I don't know if it's fair to turn to you first. Samira may have frozen again, so.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect.
I just wanted to thank everybody. Thank you so much, Scott, for this opportunity. I know my internet is really choppy, so I'm going to keep it quick. Thank you for this opportunity. I think this is a very well needed conversation that has to happen in Milton specifically on a continuous basis. And so anytime the chamber needs me to jump in and to speak about this, I am available. Consider me a strong supporter for the chamber when it comes to issues related to diversity and inclusion. Thank you again to Kevin for being a great partner on this. I thoroughly enjoyed doing all of our prep and meetings before this. So I hope to continue our work together, Kevin, in any other areas that I may be of assistance. Thank you to all my friends who joined today. I appreciate it. And you being here really gave me the confidence I needed to just go through with this and say what I had to say. Thank you again.
That's great. Thanks, Kevin.
First of all, I want to thank the Chamber for the opportunity to speak to the entire community. being able to have this conversation on equity, diversity, inclusion, especially within the context of the South Asian community. I think, Scott, you did mention, you bring up a really good point by determining, or rather dissecting some of these communities and understanding that we can't sometimes group everyone in one large box. So when I'm talking about the South Asian community, I'm thinking about the South Asian community, but we also have the East Asian community, and we also have the mainland and maritime Southeast Asian community. And they all have their unique differences and challenges in terms of interactions within, the Canadian mosaic, I would call it. If there's anything out of this conversation, I'm hoping that we've been able to perhaps move people to a level of curiosity to perhaps start seeking and taking a look at our environments and how our interactions and how we interact with other people and the dialogue that needs to happen out there. And if there's anything we should have out of this, is that we need to recognize that there's a lot more work to do. And I think we've made some really good strides in moving the needle on, especially over the last year, unfortunately, after the tragic killing of George Floyd. But I think we all recognize there's a lot of work to be done right across the sector. And I think there's great opportunity within that for everyone to have an opportunity to learn as we go through equity, diversity, inclusion, and trying to make sure we can bring respectful and meaningful change. And I'm hoping that obviously when we're having these discussions, we can meet everyone wherever they are, and we'll be more than happy to hold everyone's hand to really understand and dissect some of the things that people really need to understand. Thanks again.
That's great. Thank you. And we talked at the beginning of the program about this originally being a two-part series, but I pledged to you today that the conversation doesn't end here. So, it's not just a two-part series. It's an ongoing commitment from the Chamber to address this issue. So, Samira and Kevin, I truly appreciate your expertise and sharing your opinions and your challenges with us. So. To everyone that joined us today, thank you for tuning in. It has been a very important conversation, and we look forward to the continuation. Take care.